There are mornings that begin quietly, almost too quietly to notice anything unusual, and yet something inside them shifts everything. And for Winston, a small mouse dressed in a slightly worn but carefully pressed vest that he insists still makes him look composed, this morning feels like one of those moments that will linger longer than it should. He stands alone in his kitchen, one hand loosely holding a cup of coffee that has long since gone cold, not because he forgot about it, but because his attention has been captured completely by the faint glow of his phone screen, where a single headline has frozen him in place for the past 11 minutes without him even realizing how much time has passed, while in the background the soft mechanical hum of the dishwasher continues its cycle, and somewhere in the next room a cartoon plays for his child, filling the house with normalcy that sharply contrasts the quiet tension building in his chest. And on that screen, in bold, confident text, he reads that the average person in their mid-40s now has a net worth approaching $1 million, a number that does not feel informative to him, but instead lands like a subtle accusation, as if it is not just stating a fact but quietly asking him a question he has been trying not to answer for years, because Winston is 45. And Winston does not have $1 million, not even close. What he has instead is a retirement account he avoids opening, because it never quite looks the way he hopes it will. A mortgage that still stretches decades into the future like a commitment he cannot escape, and a stack of financial responsibilities that he manages carefully but never feels ahead of. And in this moment, like millions of others who will never admit it out loud, he is not just looking at a number. He is trying to figure out something much more personal and much more uncomfortable, whether he is falling behind in a race he does not remember starting, or whether the number itself is misleading him in ways he has not yet understood. And that quiet question, hanging unspoken in the air between him and the glowing screen, is what pulls him deeper into a realization that will begin to reshape everything he thought he knew about where he stands. As Winston continues to stare at the headline, there is a subtle shift in his thinking, not yet clarity but the beginning of doubt, because something about that nearly $1 million figure feels off in a way he cannot immediately articulate. And as the initial shock begins to settle, a more careful question starts to form beneath it. Not, why don't I have that much? But how can that number possibly represent reality? And this is where the illusion quietly begins to unravel. Because the number he is looking at, the one that has already managed to make him question years of effort and responsibility, is not actually a reflection of a typical person at all, but rather a mathematical construct that hides more than it reveals. Since when statisticians calculate an average, they take every individual's net worth, from the smallest to the largest, add it all together, and divide it evenly. Which sounds fair in theory but collapses under the weight of real-world inequality. Because when extreme wealth enters the equation, it does not gently influence the result. It distorts it completely, pulling the number upward until it no longer resembles the experience of the vast majority. And if Winston could step back and look at the data more carefully, he would see that while the average sits at around $975,800, the median, the number that represents the actual middle person standing in the line between richest and poorest, is only about $247,200, a gap so large that it is not just a difference in numbers but a difference in reality itself, nearly $750,000 separating perception from truth. And suddenly, that headline no longer feels like a standard to measure himself against but more like a distorted mirror. One that reflects a world where a handful of extremely wealthy individuals quietly inflate the numbers for everyone else, creating the illusion that being far behind is the norm when in fact it is the comparison itself that is flawed. And in that realization, Winston feels a brief but meaningful sense of relief, not because his situation has changed, but because for the first time in this moment, he begins to understand that the pressure he felt just minutes ago may not have come from his own shortcomings, but from a system of measurement that was never designed to represent him accurately in the first place. That brief sense of relief, however, does not last as long as Winston might hope, because, as he continues to mentally unpack what these numbers actually mean, another layer of reality begins to surface, one that is far less comforting and far more practical, and it forces him to confront a distinction that is rarely explained clearly but changes everything once you see it: the difference between having wealth on paper and having money you can actually use. Because the number that represents the median net worth, that roughly $247,000 that initially sounded like something solid and reassuring, is not sitting in a bank account waiting to be spent. It is not neatly invested in liquid assets that can be accessed in times of need, and it certainly is not available to cover unexpected expenses without consequences. Instead, the majority of that number, often somewhere between 60 to 70%, is locked inside the walls of a house, tied up in what is called home equity, which on paper appears valuable but in practice behaves very differently from cash. And as Winston begins to translate that into his own situation, the realization becomes uncomfortably clear. Because if most of his net worth exists as equity in a home, then what he truly has access to is only a small fraction of what the headline implied. And when that fraction is isolated, when the house is mentally removed from the equation, what remains is often surprisingly modest, sometimes barely enough to function as a true financial cushion. And this is where the illusion fully breaks down, because unlike numbers in an account, home equity cannot be casually used to pay for groceries. It cannot cover a sudden medical bill without initiating a complex financial process, and it certainly cannot act as a flexible safety net in everyday life. Since turning that equity into usable cash requires selling the home, which creates the immediate problem of needing another place to live at similar or higher costs, or refinancing, which extends debt obligations and introduces additional fees, or borrowing against it through instruments that often come with high interest rates, effectively forcing you to pay for access to your own value. And as this understanding settles in, Winston begins to see that the number he once thought represented stability is actually far more fragile than it appears, because it is not built on liquidity or flexibility, but on assets that are structurally difficult to use in the moments when they are needed most. And in that realization, the question he started with quietly evolves once again, shifting from "how much do I have?" to something far more important and far more revealing: how much of what I have can I actually rely on when it matters? As that question settles into his mind, Winston finds himself drifting toward the one place he has been quietly avoiding for years: the retirement account that exists somewhere between responsibility and denial. Because unlike the abstract idea of net worth, this is the number that is supposed to represent his future in its most practical form, the version of security that will eventually replace his income when he no longer works. And yet, even before opening it, he already has a sense that it will not say what he hopes it will say, and that hesitation itself reveals something important, because people rarely avoid looking at things that are going well. And when he finally allows himself to imagine the benchmark he has heard so many times, that by the age of 50 a person should have saved roughly 6 times their annual salary, the gap between expectation and reality begins to take shape in a way that feels almost physical. Because if someone like him earns around a median household income, that guideline would suggest a target somewhere near $700,000, a number that implies years of consistent saving, compounding growth, and financial stability. But when placed next to the actual data, the contrast becomes almost impossible to ignore, since the median retirement savings for people in his age range is not even close to that benchmark, sitting instead at a level that barely reaches into 6 figures, and often much lower depending on the individual. And when everything is combined, 401(k)s, IRAs, pensions, whatever exists at all, the total still falls dramatically short of what the traditional rules would suggest. And in some cases there is nothing there at all, not a small amount, not a temporary dip, but a complete absence of retirement savings, which forces a realization that is as uncomfortable as it is widespread, that a significant portion of people are approaching the later stages of their working lives without the financial structure that was once considered essential. And as Winston processes this, he begins to understand that the issue is not simply that he is behind, but that the benchmark itself may no longer reflect the conditions people are actually living in, because those rules were created in a different economic environment. One where housing was more accessible, wages behaved differently, and the path to long-term growth was less obstructed. And when those outdated expectations are applied to a reality that has fundamentally changed, the result is not guidance but discouragement, a standard that makes ordinary progress feel like failure. And yet even within that discomfort, there is a subtle shift beginning to form, because recognizing that the gap exists and understanding why it exists is the first step toward approaching it in a way that is grounded in reality rather than comparison, even if that reality is far less forgiving than the one the rules were originally built for. As the weight of those retirement numbers lingers in his mind, Winston begins to feel that familiar pressure creeping back in, the quiet instinct to turn inward and assign blame, to wonder if somewhere along the way he made the wrong decisions, missed the right opportunities, or simply failed to act when it mattered most. And yet just as that thought begins to take shape, another realization interrupts it. One that shifts the focus away from personal failure and toward something far larger and far more structural. Because when he steps back and looks not just at his own situation, but at the broader pattern across people his age, a different story starts to emerge. One that is less about individual mistakes and more about timing, because the economic environment that shaped his financial life was not the same as the one that shaped the generations before or after him. And this difference, subtle at first glance but profound in its impact, explains far more than most people realize, since those who were slightly older entered their peak earning years already holding assets that benefited from long periods of growth, while those who were younger had the advantage of entering the market during years of rapid expansion, lower barriers and opportunities that, while never guaranteed, were at least more accessible. But for those in the middle, for those like Winston, the timing created a narrow and unforgiving path, because they came of age just after major economic disruption, when recovery was slow, wages were stagnant, and confidence was fragile. And by the time stability returned and they were finally in a position to participate fully, many of the most significant growth opportunities had already passed, housing prices had surged, markets had already climbed, and the window that once allowed for relatively easier accumulation had quietly closed without announcement, leaving them to navigate a system that demanded more effort for smaller gains. And this is where the narrative that often goes unspoken becomes clear. Because when data shows that this particular age group has struggled to build wealth at the same pace as others, it is not an indictment of their discipline or intelligence, but rather a reflection of the conditions they were operating within. And as this understanding settles in, something important begins to shift inside Winston, not a sense of relief exactly, but a more grounded form of clarity, because while it does not erase the gap between where he is and where he hoped to be, it removes the false assumption that he arrived there purely through personal failure, replacing it instead with a more accurate, if more complex, understanding that the game itself changed in ways that were never clearly explained. And that recognizing this is not about making excuses, but about seeing the situation clearly enough to respond to it realistically, without the distortion of comparisons that were never fair to begin with. As that clarity settles in, Winston begins to notice something else that has been quietly shaping his financial life all along, something that no headline ever seems to capture and no benchmark ever accounts for. Yet it influences nearly every decision he makes, because when he looks beyond the numbers and into the structure of his daily responsibilities, he realizes that his income is not flowing in a single direction towards savings and investment, but is instead being pulled apart in multiple directions at the same time, stretched thin across obligations that span not just his own life, but the lives of those around him, And this is where the concept often referred to as the sandwich generation becomes more than just a term and starts to feel like a precise description of his reality. Because on one side, there are his children, still dependent in ways that are both obvious and subtle, requiring not just basic necessities, but also the invisible costs of opportunity, education, activities, and the constant desire to give them a better starting point than he had. And on the other side, there are aging parents, whose needs have begun to shift from occasional support to something more consistent and more demanding, whether that means contributing financially, managing care, or simply being present in ways that carry both emotional and economic weight. And when these two forces converge, they create a financial environment that is fundamentally different from the one assumed by traditional saving models, because those models are built on the idea that a significant portion of income can be directed toward long-term growth, when in reality, for someone in Winston's position, much of that income is already spoken for before it even arrives, allocated toward maintaining stability across multiple generations rather than building future wealth in isolation. And as he begins to mentally map out where his money actually goes each month, the pattern becomes undeniable, because what might appear from the outside as a lack of aggressive saving is in fact the result of continuous redistribution, small amounts here and there that add up to a substantial diversion away from retirement accounts and investment portfolios. And this is where the misunderstanding becomes most frustrating, because without recognizing this dynamic, it is easy to assume that falling behind is the result of poor discipline, when in truth it is often the consequence of carrying a load that the standard financial narrative does not acknowledge. And as this realization deepens, Winston starts to see his situation not as a failure to prioritize the future, but as an ongoing effort to balance the present across competing demands, an effort that, while it may slow his progress toward traditional milestones, reflects a different kind of responsibility, one that is measured not just in numbers, but in the stability and support he provides to the people who depend on him, even if that support comes at the cost of his own financial acceleration. As Winston sits with that realization, another thought quietly surfaces, one that he has never fully said out loud but has allowed to exist in the background as a kind of unspoken reassurance. The idea that even if things feel tight now, even if progress has been slower than expected, there might eventually be some form of relief waiting in the future, something that arrives not through effort but through timing, through inheritance, through the gradual transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. And at first glance, this belief does not seem unreasonable, because it is often presented as an inevitable wave, a massive shift of assets that will flow downward as older generations pass on what they have built, a concept sometimes described as the greatest wealth transfer in history. And for someone in Winston's position, balancing obligations and watching his own savings grow more slowly than he would like, the idea offers a subtle sense of comfort, a possibility that the gap he feels today might one day be closed without requiring impossible changes in the present. But as he begins to examine this belief more closely, that comfort starts to weaken, because the reality behind it is far more uneven and far less predictable than the narrative suggests. Since while it is true that large amounts of wealth will change hands over time, the distribution of that wealth is highly concentrated, meaning that a significant portion of it originates from a relatively small percentage of already wealthy households. And as a result, the majority of people will not experience that transfer in any meaningful way, receiving amounts that are modest at best and, in many cases, insufficient to alter their long-term financial trajectory. And when this is combined with the rising costs associated with aging, particularly long-term care, medical expenses, and end-of-life support, the picture becomes even clearer, because much of what might have been passed down is instead gradually consumed in the process of sustaining quality of life in later years, leaving less behind than expected. And as Winston considers this, the idea that inheritance could function as a reliable solution begins to dissolve, replaced by a more grounded understanding that, while it may exist as a possibility, It cannot be treated as a plan, because it depends on variables that are both uncertain and largely outside of his control. And in that shift, something important happens, because removing that quiet expectation forces him to look at his situation more directly, not with the hope of a future correction, but with the recognition that whatever stability he builds will most likely come from decisions made in the present, not from outcomes that arrive passively over time. And while that realization may feel less comforting at first, it carries with it a kind of clarity that is far more useful, because it replaces vague optimism with something more actionable, a focus on what can actually be influenced rather than what can only be hoped for. As Winston lets go of that final layer of passive hope, his attention shifts toward something even more structural, something that does not belong to his personal decisions or family circumstances, but instead sits at the level of the system itself, quietly influencing the future in ways that most people prefer not to examine too closely, because it feels distant until it suddenly is not. And that system is the one he has been contributing to for most of his working life. The one that was always presented as a foundation he could rely on when everything else became uncertain, a safety net designed to provide stability in retirement. Yet when he looks more closely at its projected trajectory, the certainty he once associated with it begins to soften, not because it will disappear entirely, but because the assumptions surrounding it are changing, and those changes carry real consequences, since projections indicate that within the next decade, the structure supporting these benefits will face a significant imbalance between incoming contributions and outgoing obligations, meaning that unless adjustments are made, the system will only be able to deliver a reduced portion of what was originally promised. And this is where the realization becomes difficult to ignore, because the timing of that shift does not exist in isolation. It intersects almost perfectly with the period when people like Winston will begin to depend on it most, creating a situation where the support they expected to receive may arrive diminished at the exact moment it is needed. And while this does not mean that the system collapses, it does mean that relying on it as a primary solution introduces a level of risk that cannot be dismissed. And as this understanding takes hold, it reinforces a broader pattern that has been unfolding throughout his reflections, the gradual removal of assumptions that once made the future feel more predictable. Because one by one, the ideas that seem to offer automatic stability, whether through averages, home equity, inheritance, or institutional support, reveal themselves to be either incomplete or conditional, and what remains in their place is not a sense of hopelessness, but a clearer, more grounded picture of reality. One that does not promise ease, but does offer something more valuable, the ability to make decisions based on what is actually likely rather than what was once expected. And in that clarity, even though the path forward appears more demanding, it also becomes more defined, because it shifts the focus away from waiting for systems to provide and toward actively building resilience within the constraints that exist, however imperfect they may be. As all of these layers settle into place, the distorted averages, the illiquid net worth, the underfunded retirement accounts, the pressure of supporting multiple generations, the fatting illusion of inheritance, and the uncertainty of institutional support, Winston begins to see his situation from a completely different perspective, one that feels less emotional but far more precise, because what once appeared to be a vague sense of falling behind now resolves into something much clearer. A set of numbers that interact with each other in ways that can be understood, adjusted, and to some extent influenced, and in that shift, his life does not suddenly become easier, but it does become more defined, because instead of asking whether he is doing well or poorly in comparison to others, he starts to see that the real question is how the pieces of his own financial structure fit together. How much is coming in? How much is going out? How much is growing? And how much is quietly working against him? And when he mentally lays those pieces out, the picture that emerges is not one of chaos, but of imbalance, because on one side there are assets, his home, his modest retirement savings, whatever small reserves he has managed to build over time. And on the other side there are obligations, the remaining years of his mortgage, the debts that still require attention, the ongoing costs tied to his family, and the future expenses that have not yet arrived but are already approaching. And what becomes clear is that this is no longer about identity or self-worth. It is about structure, about understanding how to shift even small elements of the equation in a direction that gradually improves the outcome. And this realization, while not dramatic, carries a quiet kind of power, because it replaces the overwhelming feeling of being judged by external standards with a more actionable focus on internal adjustments. And even though the numbers themselves may not change overnight, the way he relates to them does, transforming them from something that feels like a verdict into something that behaves more like a problem that can be worked on over time, piece by piece, decision by decision, without requiring perfection, only consistency. And in that reframing, Winston finds something he did not have at the beginning of the morning, not certainty, but a sense of direction that feels grounded enough to act on, even within the constraints that have not disappeared. As that sense of direction begins to take hold, Winston realizes something that feels almost surprising in its simplicity, because after everything he has just processed, all the complexity, all the structural challenges, all the reasons the path has been harder than expected, the solution in front of him does not arrive as a dramatic overhaul or a perfect plan, but as something much smaller, much more grounded, and yet far more actionable. Because when he looks at the remaining time ahead of him, roughly 2 decades before he reaches the point where work is no longer the default, he understands that what matters most is not achieving an ideal benchmark overnight, but activating the one mechanism that still works regardless of when you start: compounding. And the reality of compounding is that it does not require perfection to function. It only requires consistency and time. And while he may not have as much time as someone who started earlier, he still has enough for the effect to be meaningful. And when he begins to translate that into actual numbers, the path becomes clearer, because even relatively modest, consistent contributions, amounts that feel manageable rather than overwhelming, have the ability to accumulate into something substantial when given enough time to grow. And this is where the narrative shifts from abstract understanding to concrete action. Because instead of focusing on what he should have done years ago, he focuses on what he can begin doing now, small adjustments that do not require a complete restructuring of his life, but instead fit within the reality he is already living. And as he imagines taking that first step, increasing his contribution slightly, automating a portion of his income toward long-term savings, he realizes that the power of the decision is not in the size of the change, but in the fact that it initiates a process that continues beyond the moment itself. Because once the system is in motion, once the contributions are happening consistently, the growth begins to build on itself, quietly at first, almost imperceptibly but steadily over time. And in that realization, the overwhelming nature of the problem begins to shrink into something more manageable, not because the goal has become smaller, but because the path toward it has become clearer. Defined not by leaps or shortcuts, but by repeatable actions that accumulate into progress. And while this approach may not promise a version of the future that feels extravagant or effortless, it does offer something far more reliable: the possibility of stability, of reducing uncertainty, of creating a financial position that, while imperfect, is significantly stronger than the one that would exist without taking action at all. And for the first time since that headline appeared on his screen, Winston no longer feels frozen in place, because he is no longer trying to measure himself against a number that was never meant to represent him. He is beginning to build toward a future that, while still uncertain, is at least partially within his control. And as the morning that once felt heavy begins to move forward, Winston understands that the number he saw at the beginning, the one that disrupted his thoughts and made him question his progress, is no longer the number that matters, because that number was never about him to begin with. It was a generalized figure shaped by extremes, disconnected from the reality of most people's lives. And in its place, a different kind of number emerges, one that is far less visible but far more meaningful. Not a snapshot of where he stands today, but a projection of where he is heading based on the choices he makes from this point forward. Because the true measure of his situation is not whether he matches an average or even a median at a single moment in time, but whether his trajectory is moving in a direction that gradually strengthens his position over the years that remain. And this shift in perspective changes the entire frame of the question he started with. Because instead of asking whether he is behind compared to others, he begins to ask whether the actions he is taking today are improving the version of himself that will exist 10, 15, or 20 years from now. And when viewed through that lens, even small decisions take on greater significance, because they are no longer isolated. They are part of a pattern that compounds not just financially, but psychologically, reinforcing a sense of agency that was missing before. And in that sense, the most important number is not the one written down at the beginning of the day, but the one that has not yet been calculated, the one that will be shaped by consistency, by discipline that does not need to be perfect, and by a willingness to engage with reality rather than avoid it. And as Winston finally sets his phone down and picks up the coffee he forgot, now completely cold but somehow less important than it felt before, there is a subtle shift in how he carries himself. Not a dramatic transformation, but a quieter, more stable awareness that, while the race may have started earlier than he realized, it has not ended, and the finish line, wherever it ultimately falls, is still influenced by what he chooses to do next.